Two people wore the same blue shirt, stood at the same spot above the same tank at the same time of day. Within a week, the octopus was soaking only one of them. That was the whole point of the design. Identical clothing, identical position, identical routine. Every difference stripped out except one. One person always brought food. The other touched the octopus with a bristly stick, gently but persistently. To an animal with no color vision, looking up through moving water, those two humans should have been the same pale smear against the same ceiling lights. The octopuses didn't agree. So the question isn't really whether an octopus can tell two people apart. It's what happens to that information afterwards. Does it fade like a smell, or does it sit somewhere, waiting, attached to a specific face? I'll tell you now that this story splits in a frustrating way. The cleanest evidence lasts about 2 weeks. The most haunting case has almost no data at all. Both matter, and keeping them separate is the only honest way to do this. Most of us assume the answer is chemistry. Octopuses taste with their skin. Thousands of chemical sensors across the suckers. It would be easy to say the animal simply smelled the fish on one person's hands and the disturbance on the others. Easy and probably wrong, because in that Seattle aquarium work, the reaction started before contact. At first sight, the octopuses drifted toward the feeder and backed away from the other person, sometimes swiveling that muscular funnel, the siphon they used to jet through water, in the direction of the one they'd learned to dislike. Now separate the two layers. What researchers actually recorded were approaches, retreats, breathing rate, and skin patterns, including a dark bar of pigment that spreads across the eyes when the animal is aroused. What they inferred is that the octopuses had built some stable representation of two individual humans. Those are not the same claim. The behavior is measured. The representation is an interpretation of it. The animals were discriminating. Whether they were remembering in the way you remember someone is a bigger step. Here's what makes the visual side genuinely strange. Octopus eyes have essentially one type of photoreceptor, which should mean the world arrives in shades of brightness, not color. Some researchers have proposed that odd pupil shapes could let them wring color information out of blur, an elegant idea that's still argued over. Whatever the mechanism, the octopus in that tank was picking out a person using shape, brightness, movement, and possibly the polarization of light, a property of light our eyes ignore completely, and theirs are unusually sensitive to. Picture that for a second. You are being identified by something that may never have seen your face as a face, only as a pattern of light that behaves in a particular way. And it worked in a week. The hardware exists to make that stick. Octopuses have a brain region called the vertical lobe, and lab work on it suggests something surprisingly familiar: a fast, short-term learning system feeding a slower, long-term one, using synaptic strengthening similar in principle to what happens in mammal brains. Damage that region, and long-term recall suffers. Two very different evolutionary experiments, separated by more than 500 million years, arrived at comparable solutions for holding on to experience. So the storage problem is solved. That still doesn't get us to a grudge, because telling two people apart is a sorting task. A grudge is something else. It requires the memory to carry a value, a lingering negative weight tied to one individual, surviving long after the last encounter. And here's where I'd like you to actually pick a side before the next part. Do you think what that octopus stored was a category or a feeling? Hold your answer. At the New England Aquarium in Boston, staff described a giant Pacific octopus named Truman, who took an apparent dislike to one particular young volunteer. Whenever she came near, he'd hit her with a jet of salt water. Not everyone, her. Eventually, she left the position for college, and by the accounts of the people working there, Truman stopped squirting visitors altogether. Months later, she came back for a visit. He soaked her immediately. That story is, scientifically speaking, a mess. One animal, one observer group who already knew the history. No blinding, no controls. No way to rule out that she moved differently, stood in a familiar spot, or that the people around her reacted in a way the octopus had learned to read. It would never pass peer review, and it shouldn't. It's also the single most interesting thing in this entire subject, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. The clean experiment proves discrimination over 2 weeks. The uncontrolled anecdote hints at something lasting months, and there is currently no published study that closes that gap. Nobody has run the long interval version. Scientists cannot yet tell you how long an octopus holds a human. That's the honest state of the field, not a disclaimer, the actual mystery. What we can say is that octopuses appear capable of carrying negative states, not just negative reflexes. Research on pain in cephalopods has found that after an injury, octopuses will avoid the specific location where it happened and prefer a place associated with relief from it. That's the signature of an experience with a lasting emotional color attached, rather than a simple reflex that fires and resets. It doesn't prove Truman felt anything about that volunteer. It does mean the ingredients aren't obviously missing. So where does that leave the revenge story? Probably in the wrong words. Revenge implies a plan, a sense of fairness, a debt being settled. Nothing in the evidence supports that. What the evidence does support is narrower, and I'd argue stranger. An animal with no color vision, no social life, and no relatives on our branch of the tree, building a stable file on one specific human, tagging it as bad, and keeping the tag long enough to act on it without hesitation the moment that shape reappeared. Not a vendetta, a very confident act of recognition, with an opinion attached. Which is the part I keep coming back to, the eye bar. That dark stripe of pigment that rises across the eyes when a giant Pacific octopus is stirred up. In the Seattle work, it was one of the measurable signals that shifted depending on which human showed up. An animal that hides for a living, that vanishes into rock and sand, whose entire survival strategy is not being noticed, cannot keep its opinion of you off its own skin. It sees you, decides something, and the decision surfaces in pigment before it ever reaches the funnel. You just have to be standing there to read it. If you know that story, the one about the volunteer who came back, which explanation would you put your money on? That the octopus recognized her specifically, or that it read something in how the room behaved around her? I'd genuinely like to see the split in the comments. And if you like animal questions where the evidence stops before the story does, there'll be more of them here.